Good evening and welcome. I am Sister Barbara Reed, President of Catholic Theological Union, and I am so delighted to welcome you this evening on behalf of all of us at CTU to this program, In Good Faith. More than 13 years ago, the Bernardine Center for Theology and Ministry at CTU took a new step forward in our ongoing commitment to promote interreligious dialogue. In partnership with the First Analysis Institute for Integrative Studies, we launched In Good Faith, Jews, Christians, and Muslims sharing perspectives on issues that matter to our faith communities and to our world. This was an exciting project featuring an extended trilateral dialogue that would then continue over the next dozen years and more. In Good Faith brings together key leaders from the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities in Chicago and beyond to develop and foster deeper mutual understanding and stronger relationships of trust. In this new era, we've adapted to a virtual format, relaunching this series with two of our own faculty members, Dr. Malka Zeiger-Simkovich and Dr. Saeed Atif Riswan, representing the Jewish and Islamic faiths, along with our colleague, Dr. Steve Davidson from McCormick Theological Seminary, representing a Christian perspective. CTU is especially grateful to Oliver and Catherine Nicklin and the First Analysis Institute of Integrative Studies for their support to ensure that In Good Faith continues to offer a paradigm for ongoing trilateral dialogue.
Good evening. I begin in the name of God, the more compassionate, the more merciful. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. May God's infinite peace, blessings, and mercy be upon all of you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. As part of the opening prayer, I will recite the opening chapter of the Quran, Al-Fatiha. I will do so in Arabic and then provide the English translation. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maliki yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdina as-siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladina an'amta alayhim. غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. Ameen. In the name of God, the more compassionate, the more merciful. All praise belongs to God, the Lord of the worlds, the Lord of mercy, the master of the day of recompense. It is you we worship, and it is you from whom we ask for help. So guide us on the morally and ethically straight path, the path that is used by those you have blessed, and not the one that causes enmity or discord, such as those who cause enmity and discord. Amen.
And good evening, everyone. I'm Steve Millies, a member of the faculty and director of the Bernardine Center at Catholic Theological Union. As Sister Barbara mentioned, CTU's been home to these In Good Faith conversations with the support of the First Analysis Institute for Integrative Studies for many years now, and we hope to keep the conversation going for many more. In Good Faith always has been a trialogue, a meeting of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. But as the only Catholic Christian on tonight's panel, let me claim a privilege and recall the words of Pope Francis 10 days ago on the plain of Ur, where Francis reminded us, the greatest blasphemy is to profane God's name by hating our brothers and sisters. Hostility, extremism, and violence are not born of a religious heart. They are betrayals of religion. That's our spirit here tonight. We're coming together in good faith to learn from one another, to be friends with one another, and to affirm our commitment to coming to know God better through one another, through this world created for all of us. As we begin, let me call your attention to two documents in the chat. One is a program for the evening that you can download that will give you some idea of where we're all going. After our panel discussion here, we're going to dismiss the audience to small breakout groups where we'll invite you to share with one another a little of your own experience of faith and community during this pandemic year. We hope you'll find yourself with people of different faiths. For that, the other document is the one that Sister Barbara mentioned. You'll find it linked in the chat, and it's intended to guide us, some principles of dialogue that encourage us all to listen and to really hear one another, to guide a conversation toward a true exchange. But before all that, we'll have a panel discussion. And for that, let me introduce our panel in no particular order, but alphabetical. Dr. Steve Davidson is the Dean of the Faculty and Vice President of Academic Affairs at McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago's beautiful Hyde Park neighborhood, where he is also Professor of Hebrew Bible, and we are grateful to welcome our neighbor here tonight, Dr. Davidson. Dr. Saeed Atif Rizwan is Assistant Professor of Islamic and Interreligious Studies here at CTU, where he's also the Director of the Catholic Muslim Studies program. This pandemic year has been Dr. Rizwan's first year full-time at CTU, though we've all gotten to know him over the last few years. We're glad to welcome him here, and we look forward to welcoming him in person. Dr. Malka Simkovich is the Crown Ryan Chair of Jewish Studies and Director of the Catholic Jewish Studies program here at CTU. Since Dr. Simkovich was a member of the committee that hired me at CTU almost 4 years ago, it feels awkward for me to welcome her, but I'm certainly glad she's here. And now I think we can have a rich conversation about faith and worship during and after the pandemic, this strange, singular, once-in-a-lifetime event that we have all experienced despite all of our differences together. And for that, I'd like to turn to the panel and open with a question to no one in particular, but certainly to all of you. Tell us a little bit, if you would, about your own experience of faith and practice during the pandemic. What have you learned? What's been different? What's surprised you? And I'll invite anybody to jump in and be first before I pick someone.
Well, let me start, since I'm alphabetically first. You set up a precedent here, Steve. So what I discovered is that some of the things I thought was the heart of a worshiping community are really the peripheries. I mean, for me, I discovered really that faith, spirituality, tradition, and worship really grows within the community and the gathered community of people, rather than the ritual, the tradition, the proclamation. And so these were the things I would have thought were central. And I came to discover that when you can't gather around those, and those still become available, they're not as compelling as when you're doing them in this disaggregated space away from the community. So what I missed was, not realized, is how central other people and the interaction with other people are to my own sense of faith, my own sense of participation in a worshiping community. My sense was that this kind of pulled us in different direction. And even though there were people who would tell us that people do on a Sunday some of the same patterns they take during the week, so that they would drive in the same direction to work, and therefore drive in that direction to go to church. That might make sense in another way, but it didn't really make the same sense in the time of the pandemic, so that the things that people were willing to do, or in some ways forced to do, to maintain their work and their livelihood, they now realize, I don't have to do those things to be a part of a religious and worshiping community. And so therefore let's do the stuff online in order to maintain the identity of the community, was not in many ways as successful. Or if it was successful, it took a different form. And I could talk about that a little bit later, but that's where I want to start.
Saeed, I saw you nodding there vigorously.
I guess that's the cue for me to jump in. I was nodding because as Steve was talking about reimagining what it means to interact with the community during the pandemic, definitely touches on my own experience. At the start of it last year, within a few short weeks, Ramadan started, and Ramadan is certainly a time for spiritual reflection and for inward looking moments, especially during the day when one is fasting from sunrise to sunset. But in the evening, during the time of breaking of the fast, the iftar, it's very communal. I mean, it's one of the exciting parts of Ramadan to get together with friends and family and to be excited about the types of foods that will be on the table, and as well as the supererogatory prayers that are done at nighttime in the mosque with folks. And you develop a sense of camaraderie that you see the same folks every evening, and you get a chance to, catch up with them before, after some of the prayers and the breaks, and all those things vanished, and they weren't there anymore. And so that was different to be at home constantly and to be doing or missing all these communal parts of it, and at the same time trying to stay focused. On the other side, one of the things that I actually really enjoyed was performing the Eid prayer at home, the celebration prayer that is done that marks the end of Ramadan. And the reason was that at home, I got a chance to do it with my wife and my son sitting right next to me. And in a mosque, when one listens to the sermon, one has to stay quiet. And a 3-year-old is not exactly one to stay quiet during a sermon. And so to be at home and, he asked questions and we were interacting, it was a very different experience, but in a way that was incredibly deep and enriching for me. And it was a blessing in that way. So for me, the experience has been schizophrenic in some ways. The longing to be connected with my friends and family, and then also the beauty of being able to be home with my immediate family and sharing in a way that I had never experienced before, and being able to do so, which was quite special.
Yeah, I would build on that precisely. A year ago, almost to the day, I prayed on a Shabbat on a Saturday morning in my living room with my husband and my 4 kids for the first time in our entire lives. And my son is 15, almost 16. So he was 14 before we all prayed together on a Shabbat morning. It had never happened because we're praying maybe in one room in the synagogue, but also with 150 other people. So it was a totally new experience, and one that initially we welcomed. And we would take walks in the summer afternoons on Saturday, and from a socially distanced position, we would say hi to our friends, and we would all say, "Isn't it amazing? It's a totally new experience. We're, having this family-centered Shabbat that we had never had before." And then by the fall, it felt very sad. By the fall, it felt very hard. And then the winter came. But in a broader sense, we sort of think of our religious lives as either within a personal, private, internalized domain, or within the communal space of whether it's a church or a mosque or a synagogue. But there's another domain, and that's the family domain. And I learned to deeply appreciate the family as a space that is a religious spiritual unit. But it also led me to think about the fact that so many of us don't have conventional family structures. So many of us aren't living with others at all, or our family might look different than my very conventional family. Our family might not be blood relatives, but family nonetheless. And so I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be a unit, a home, a family that lives together, whatever that might mean, but thinking especially about those who've been living by themselves for the past year. And that is something that I can't imagine. This has been a very, very long year, even for those of us who have found comfort in physically being with our loved ones in the same house. But I do hear what Steve and Saeed are saying, and it resonates very profoundly. This internalization of the spiritual experience has been very tied into my personal experiences with my family, and I recognize how very lucky I am for that.
I mean, that's the point that you're raising, Malka, about thinking about those who don't have a traditional family or are alone. It's a really great point that you brought up, because one of the things that I thought about was a deep appreciation for not being alone, for having the family and being able to spend time with them, and thinking about those who don't have them. And so, thanks for bringing that up and putting a spotlight on that, because truly that is one of those things that came into sharp focus through this insane year that we've had.
Well, I have this sort of a tension between connection and disconnection, because, and I think this is part of the struggle, where for some people, the isolation was the problem. And then for some people, the isolation was the solution, or at least the ability to negotiate isolation and connection on their own terms became part of the solution. And for me, I have that kind of a schizophrenic tension thing where in some sense it feels to me that there's this great wonderful opportunity to grow into spiritual practices based upon isolation. And I don't belong to traditions that fall into those categories or value those types of things. I think Protestantism is more about, let's just pack people in. And I found myself very resistant at times to that. And in some ways, valuing, as Malka is pointing out, the organic arrangement that a family brings, where it's like we could start it when we want to, we could end it when we want to, we could make it as long as we want to. It's really the people who, it's all of the dynamics of family. You either love them, hate them, and all of those different things. You can't live with, they are yours, whether you want them or not. So that, that for me was discovering the power of that space and those types of units and those types of relation. And relating as a path towards spiritual development was just fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, Steve, I kind of chuckled when you talked about that those who may have enjoyed the isolation. I was thinking that there are Muslim mystics, Sufis that indulge in isolation, and so they were probably like, this is a walk in the park, and preferred it and brought it on. I mean, in different ways in which mysticism is practiced in all the traditions that we share here. There's also those that didn't necessarily see the quarantining or those that that maintain fidelity to that type of isolation as necessarily a negative thing.
I wonder, in the before times, as we say, I think we would agree, although correct me if you disagree, that all of our religious traditions do in some ways prioritize the communal over the personal in terms of normative ritual, normative prayer, and things like that. And so I wonder if the past year, which has obviously given us new opportunities to internalize and look inward and think about our faith through the private experience, I wonder if this will help balance things out as we sort of emerge out of our hibernation. Are we going to leave the cocoon transformed? Are we going to go back into our communities and say, okay, we need a better balance now? We've had a year of sort of inward looking, this personal, intensely intimate experience of worshiping privately. Now that we're going back into these public spaces, can we find a better equilibrium? Can we find a better balance and find ways to sort of empower on a more local level those things which energized us? And this is actually what I'm hoping for, but to sort of speak in concrete terms about what that would look like is not totally clear to me.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and I would want to be optimistic here, and I think if the question is asked of what people will choose to do, I would definitely say I think people will find ways to continue that. If you're thinking institutionally and organizationally, oh, those buildings are too compelling to leave behind, and to withdraw from them even small amounts of activities, to relocate them either virtually or within the home. And I think that's where the challenge will be. And hopefully there is enough push from people demanding a continuation of some of these richer experiences that will say, no, we definitely have to rethink this. Because I mean, I think that there is a real value in discovering that the congregation or this local community is no longer bound by the building, no longer bound by geography. I should say no longer, but has not been for some months, right? That look, there's this expansion of an audience that just transcended the geographies that we normally use. So hopefully there is something there that we could actually build upon.
Yeah, I mean, and this is partly a question too for my dear panelists, all three of you, is last year I was teaching history of Muslim-Christian relations, and it was during the pandemic, obviously, and so we're all on Zoom, and we took some time to go around just talking about what we're appreciative of in the moment. And my Catholic students, a number of them were seminarians, were saying that they're very happy that, and they're very grateful that they could take part in the Eucharist. And I didn't know why. And so I asked the question, well, why is that the case? And then they explained to me why it is so important to be part of, to take part in the Eucharist and to receive it, and what it means in terms of one's connectedness to God. And that, in fact, actually ended up then leading to a debate among the Catholics in the room, because one of my other Catholic students said, well, what about for those who aren't able to do this, right? And what about even in normal times, there are places in the world where there are Catholic communities that have a priest that comes once a year. And it is only during that time that they can receive the Eucharist in the strict canon sense. And so what happens in all these other times? And what does that then mean for these individuals in terms of their connectedness to God? And so it was a really fascinating discussion that emerged. And it also helped me to reflect on my own tradition. Fridays, Muslims get together for the afternoon prayer. And there are certain rules that are in place in terms of how many people physically have to be present to conduct this afternoon prayer. And different religious authorities across the world said that it's okay to hold this afternoon prayer virtually. Others said no. And this debate is still going on. And I participated in virtual prayers, and others say, no, absolutely not. And unless you can get into the mosque, you can't do it. And so it's really helped to shed light on the ways in which we talk about ritual vis-a-vis community and then its connectedness to God. And I'd be curious, as I said, for my esteemed and dear panelists, in what ways you've have thought about this, and any thoughts that you may have to share.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the big questions we're going to be asking as we move into a new stage, hopefully a post-pandemic stage, is can virtual opportunities be religious opportunities? And this will take all kinds of forms. In my introduction to Judaism class, since you're speaking about your teaching, I'll give a corollary example. And I do view this as a religious experience. In my introduction to Judaism, I invite as many Jewish friends as I can in a series that I call Meet a Jew. And basically it's speed dating with Jews. But basically I put it on Facebook. It's not a very sophisticated search system. And I ask my 1,500 closest friends who can volunteer to call in for 5 minutes. And you have to be humble because you can't talk for 4 minutes and 45 seconds about yourselves. You have a minute to self-define, and then you have to take questions. And people love this. I always, within 10 minutes, it's already like I'm completely booked. And what I try to do is get a variety of friends from from a variety of Jewish traditions and denominations and ethnicities, Jews of color, Sephardi Jews, Iranian Jews, whatever. But the point is that when this happened, first of all, it would have never happened had I not been teaching virtually. It would never have occurred to me 2 years ago to do this. It felt like a spiritual experience. Now, I know I'm not speaking traditionally. This is not, it's not a prayer and it's not a synagogue service, but it felt almost transcendent. It felt new. It felt meaningful in a way that, hours and hours and hours of me droning on and on could not have created the same effect of having 10 very different Jewish people call in within an hour, say, hi, here's who I am, ask me anything. And so I'm speaking very broadly when I say, how can our virtual opportunities be transformative as religious opportunities? And I guess a more traditional example would be Passover is coming up, and I have friends who are going to be having Zoom seders so that they could have seder with their grandparents or with relatives who are immunocompromised. And I have friends, and I'll be honest, I'm one, myself included, who will not be using electricity on the holiday, and so we won't have those Zoom seders. So the questions are going to be forthcoming as we go through the next cycle of the holiday calendar.
Oh, yeah, I resonate with some of what you're saying there, Malka. Of course, the thing about the Zoom Seder is you miss all of the wonderful food that is supposed to be there. So, yeah. But this I have found to be an important thing. We started thinking in terms of, from an educational point of view as well, as to how we support our interfaith work of, again, missing the pieces of introducing students to other religious traditions by visiting worship sites and all of these other things. We didn't get the sites, but we were able to do some relational pieces like that, interact with that. And I think this is this wonderful opportunity of persons performing these kinds of interfaith transactions, if I want to call them that, of, look, we can meet people and build those relationships. In my own community, one of the more healthy things that occurred was these small group meetings that were based upon interest groups. But, and in some senses, people who already knew each other, they were raising children at the same age, or they were single, or, a number of different things like those. But some of the ones that were quite surprising were the ones that were formed upon people who self-selected and selected with individuals that they had not known previously, and built these relationships with individuals across all sorts of lines of differences of age, of race, of geographical location, and things like that. And just, and I mean, it wasn't a great thing that was changing the world, but it was meaningful for those individuals to get into those opportunities and start to learn from persons. And it turned out to be people who were not necessarily as strong or clear in the faith as everyone was. Some were fairly marginal, some had no faith, but it was just a space to meet people and to build relationships. So that I think is just great and fantastic opportunities. It requires us then in some ways to have a much more expansive understanding of what a spiritual experience would feel like and look like.
Exactly.
Let me, if I could, throw another vegetable into the pot here, because I think there's, I'm very struck by this conversation about the expansive possibility, and I'm thinking back to sort of where it began when Steve talked about the idea that being confined geographically, being confined as a community to this building, this has been a diminishing reality. In some ways, for a long time, people have been selecting themselves into different worship communities. But one of the other things that I think all three traditions share that's perhaps less cheerful to talk about is disaffiliation. That we have been living against a backdrop of disaffiliation for a long time now, people no longer participating in their religious communities. I can remember reading some articles about a year ago where some writers were speculating, as these calamitous events have been in the past, will the pandemic be good for religion? And I just wonder if you've thought at all about, first of all, what the answer to that question might be, but second, what opportunities might exist here in a sort of a decentered, a sort of a centrifugal idea of religious community as a thing that we can do sometimes together, but sometimes in lots of other contexts too. Anybody? Solve the problem of disaffiliation, please.
So I will talk about it from the perspective of migration, because that's where I've seen it the most, in the sense that you have people migrate out of rural areas. So there's this in-country migration where people move out of the communities that they grew up in and they go to these urban areas. The people who grew up in church don't necessarily connect to church in the places where they relocate. And we see it also in terms of the migration across countries. Again, there is, so that what you have is people disaffiliate in many ways from the original church community that they grew up in. And they may disaffiliate precisely because those strings are cut and they've created new ones. And there are others because they just don't. And what the pandemic did was to pull some of those people back into that original sort of a home church that they had moved away from geographically, and in a number of different ways. So there is that possibility of where I'm seeing now this pull. Now, in some ways, what it does, it may artificially inflate some of those churches in terms of what their numbers look like, but what it offers is this sense of connectivity, this idea then that, look, faith might evolve for some people in some ways that really takes them far afield, but that for a number of people, what they want is something that's fairly close to what they have grown up on. So that's the part that I'm intrigued by, and seeing how those early relationships continue to sort of maintain themselves for people.
Steve, when you're asking this question, are you asking about disaffiliation as a product of increased isolation, or disaffiliation as a product of suffering in general?
Well, I think that we've been seeing across the board, Pew and others have measured disaffiliation and declining participation in religious traditions. This has been a phenomenon people have written about for decades. The pandemic arrives at the end of decades of this, and so I'm thinking of it more in that larger canvas context.
I mean, I guess I don't approach suffering as an existential crisis for Judaism. Judaism has plenty of other existential crises. But suffering doesn't seem to be one of them. You know, the Holocaust just happened a second ago in the Jewish communal memory. So I don't view this as like a traumatic event that puts us on the precipice existentially. I think any crisis can make you either more religious or less religious. So I suppose I suppose we won't have the answers to those questions for many years to come. So I'm not sure if Saeed has more wisdom on that.
Yeah, I think you're right, Malka, in that, you know, time will tell what this means. You know, to the extent that right now, where can you go? I mean, the pandemic has exacerbated what I think is a challenge. I mean, I know for sure in the Muslim community, and in talking with some of my Catholic friends at CTU as well, that there is a exodus of youth from the community, and the pandemic has just exacerbated that. And so, what is the reason for this exodus? What is going on? And so, if the pandemic is accelerating that, then that's more of a reflection of what we as a community, obviously speaking from one Muslim perspective, what we have to do to help create better bonds for the next generation, or the generation that come up, especially now with ones that are experiencing a lot of interaction with fellow human beings through the internet or through Zoom calls. And so I think that's the way I would look at it right now, in terms of where we are and why we ended up in this way in terms of numbers and disaffiliation, and where it could go based on what the challenges that have already existed.
But the question that you raised, Steve, is in some ways getting at this issue of belonging, and which is an important question. But I think that there are certain ways in which we measure belonging, and I think those may vary across our traditions. So I think, does participation equal belonging? Does virtual participation equal belonging? Does a haphazard virtual participation equal belonging? Those will be questions that we'll have to ask to see, and whether or not. I mean, and then again is, so one of the other measures of belonging tends to be financial contributions. Again, which in some ways, that's a bit of a variable thing in these days. Again, what would be the new measures of belonging that we would use to say, hey, here's what affiliation looks like now?
Mm-hmm.
I want to be sure that I want to make sure that I jump in and cue the audience that in about 9 minutes, we're going to be going to small groups. And there is something that Malka touched on that I want to make sure that we talk about. And it was something that came up early as well. And it's this idea of, well, I mean, it's the tremendous suffering that has taken place over the last year, and not just isolation, but there's been economic hardship. There have been people who have been close to us that we've been unable to grieve and mourn properly according to our rituals and traditions. And of course, there have been the deaths themselves. There's been hospitalization, there's been illness. And I sort of want to invite you to think a little bit about the different ways that our traditions process suffering, the different ways that we think about, much as we think about belonging differently, or might think about belonging differently. We think about suffering differently. Our traditions teach us this. What are some of the ways you suppose that we might have experienced this event differently for all that we've experienced together?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. I think that there's a common misunderstanding sometimes when it comes to the Christian, and here this is a gross overgeneralization, but in my limited anecdotal experience, some of my Christian friends have made assumptions that the Jewish approach to suffering parallels their own Christian approach. And the truth is that, and again, I hesitate to say Judaism says or the rabbis say, but in broad strokes, there isn't a dominant tradition in Judaism that argues that suffering is necessarily meaningful or cathartic. I mean, there's an equally dominant approach that suffering is incomprehensible because the universal omnipotent God who decreed the suffering is incomprehensible. And so all we can do is name the suffering and sit in it and grieve. And sometimes it means we challenge God. There's a very powerful rabbinic trope of the rabbis challenging God, and sometimes we forgive God. And there are also rabbinic traditions about God suffering with the people as they suffer, God going down into exile with the people, God sitting in exile and waiting for redemption, all these fascinating kind of humanizations of God to comprehend this question of theodicy. So I don't know that suffering has inherent meaning always in my tradition. Well, actually, let me stop there because I could go on and on, but I want to make sure others have an opportunity to weigh in.
So, I think there's a rich Christian tradition that deals with suffering. I'm not too sure that more recent Christian practices have emphasized and drawn on those traditions well enough. So the pandemic started during Lent, and this is our second Lent that we're experiencing it, and thematically and theologically, it was in some ways an ideal time and space to do a whole number of other things. The sort of centrality of the cross within Christianity, this crucified God. There are those rich traditions. However, it tends to be a lot of sort of popular Christianity in many ways tends to be much more focused on Easter and Christmas rather than, say, Lent Good Friday. And so parts of what we got, and some of what I found it necessary to stay away from the places and the people who thought that their divine calling was to be preaching hope, and hope more or less as a kind of a neoliberal production of feel-good self-help, draw yourself up type of a ideologies. So those I found just bothersome to me rather than some others. But the tradition is there. The tradition is very rich, is very deep, but doesn't always get the kind of publicity has a kind of attraction as it does to today. And I dare say that that's what I felt, or I perceive a number of people were doing when they, in some ways, disaggregated from these big communal spaces of worship to figure out ways in which they could now feel the suffering a whole lot more and connect more with that and work through that as a spiritual experience.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. There's a lot of different ways in which Muslims historically have written about hardships and suffering, and the ways in which it's also engaged in the Quran. It definitely, the Quran, at least, to begin with, acknowledges that there is something called pain and that humans feel it, and it's very much okay to be in that and to live in that space and those feelings. And it ties it oftentimes with the idea, which in Arabic is called tawakkul, which is a absolute reliance on God. And it is this sort of confidence that one ought to have that the hardship one is facing will come eventually to an end. And there's a couple of verses in the Quran that speak about that. With hardship comes ease, and with hardship comes ease. It says it twice. So there is this idea of recognizing it, and then also trying to help one to orient towards, well, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and the hardship is the tunnel, but there's something different that comes afterwards. And then, of course, the mystics have their own take on suffering as well, and they see that as a mechanism for bringing themselves closer to God. And through withstanding the hardship, it allows them to then think through God and to think about the uniqueness and the oneness of God by relying on the possible reasons for why that could have happened. And so, I think ultimately what I would say is that the tradition, the different folks that have speak in the tradition recognize it, and then also speak about this important concept called tawakkul, which is this confidence in God that things will shift and improve.
We've got about 2 minutes left before we go to small groups. So I want to sort of formulate a question for each of you to answer to sort of wrap up this portion of the evening. And to perhaps inspire conversation in the small groups. And the question is a simple one. In the light of everything we've talked about, and in the light of the challenges that we've encountered, and in light of the new experiences that we've had, in light of what we've suffered, and the hope that comes from the end of suffering, what do you hope for your own practice and to find in your own communities when this is over?
I think one of the things that we're going to be grappling with for many years is not, as you said, Steve, just the loss of lives, the loss of health, the loss of economic stability, but also the loss of comfort, the loss of confidence in the future, the loss of feeling like we are in control, feeling that we are prepared. And so the loss of feeling like we're moving towards something stable and predictable. And I think that loss could be productive. I think it can be humbling. I think we could bring it into our spiritual communities. I think we could bring it into our spiritual private lives. I think we can harness it, and I think it can be healthy. And this is not, God forbid, to minimize the suffering or to sort of invalidate it, but just to say, maybe it's okay to say, we are really not in control. And that's the human experience. And it's an anomaly that for however many years I lived before the pandemic, I thought I was in control, because if you look at human history, that's not the story. And so I think that this could be a productive idea to bring into our spiritual lives.
For me, I would put it as a more of a democratization of spirituality and spiritual experiences. And in some ways, I think there is a way within which spirituality and spiritual life has become so mystified that it becomes a stumbling block to a lot of people. There are these boundaries that you have to cross. There are these pathways that you have to cross. There are these things that you have to perform. There is this, and so for me, just opening up the spaces for people to occupy that. And in one sense, I can't complain too much about a very professionalized way within which spirituality has occurred, because to do that is in some ways to say, oh, we don't need seminaries, you don't need to be teaching people this. But the point I'm actually making is to democratize even the practice of theological education as to who it is for and what and why is it valuable. And so those are the places that I would hope that happens, that not just simply the physical walls are dismantled around religious communities and religious spaces, but all of the other walls that have been erected over time. And some of these are walls that were there to protect religion against sort of post-enlightenment and all of these other, and postmodernism and so on, that, you know, we could break them down and democratize it a whole lot more without thing, because if the faith is strong enough, it should withstand those things without all of these walls that have been erected.
I mean, there's a lot of different things that come to my mind. You know, as a historian of Islamic legal tradition and being married to a criminal defense attorney, you know, law is very, you know, present in my life. And so the formality of law is something that I respect, and what that means in terms of both religious and interpersonal interactions. But going back to something that raised earlier about, for example, what does it mean to conduct a Friday afternoon prayer virtually, and whether it's permissible or not. What I hope that, you know, Muslims will think about is, to what extent do we want to worship God versus worship Islam? And what does that mean, to worship God and not Islam? And what does that then mean in the way in which we create, you know, parameters about how to, you know, to build that vertical relationship, and what can be permissible versus impermissible?
I want to thank my good friends, our panelists, Malka, Saeed, and Steed. It's always such a privilege to hear people who have so much learning come together and talk about their learning, but it's even more of a privilege when you have the willingness and the courage to bring your personal experiences together with all of that learning, and really have an interaction with all of us that exposes who you are and what you believe as human beings. So I'm very grateful to all of you for what I think has been a great half hour of conversation. In just a moment now, we're going to be sending you all to have a short conversation with one another about all of this in small groups for about 15 minutes to help put us all in the right place to really hear and engage with one another. Let's begin with prayer. I'd like to invite everyone to take a breath and gather yourself into silence. And I'll invite Malka to offer a few words of prayer.
Thank you, Steve. I would like to share with you part of a prayer that was delivered by Rabbi Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel, the great 20th century Jewish philosopher, who was a leading figure in interreligious dialogue in the years leading up to the Second Vatican Council. In August of 1969, Heschel gave the opening convocation at the National Liturgical Conference in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And in this convocation, he described the nature of prayer as an experience that flows from spirit into action, I would now like to share a few of Heschel's words. Prayer must pervade as a climate of living, and all our acts must be carried out as variations on the theme of prayer. A deed of charity, an act of kindness, a ritual moment, each is prayer in the form of a deed. Such prayer involves a minimum or even an absence of outwardness and an abundance of inwardness. Prayer is like an established residence for the innermost self. All things have a home. The bird has a nest, the fox has a hole, the bee has a hive. A soul without prayer is a soul without a home. Weary, sobbing, the soul, after roaming through a world festered with aimlessness, seeks a moment in which to gather up its scattered life, in which to divest itself of pretensions and camouflage, in which to call for help without being a coward. Such a home is prayer. How marvelous is my home! I enter as a suppliant and emerge as a witness. I enter as a stranger and emerge as next of kin. I enter spiritually shapeless and emerge wholly changed. Let the spirit of prayer interfere in the affairs of humankind. Prayer is private, a service of the heart, but let concern and compassion, born out of prayer, dominate public life. Prayer is a confrontation with a God who demands justice and compassion. As long as there is a shred of hatred in a human heart, as long as there is a vacuum without compassion anywhere in the world, there is an emergency. Prayer is meaningless unless it is subversive, unless it seeks to overthrow and ruin the pyramids of callousness and hatred. We are called to bring together sparks, to preserve single moments of radiance and keep them alive, to defy absurdity and despair, and to wait for God to say again, let there be light, and there will be light. As we go into breakout rooms and engage further in our dialogue, I want to invite all of you to consider encountering this dialogue as an act of prayer, as an act of divine service, and as an act of building, in Heschel's words, a common sacred home. Thank you.
Thank you, Malka. The one thing that I have learned from this year of being in Zoom is that there is never enough time in small groups. So we will apologize to you if that was true tonight, but of course that just means the conversations were good, which I hope is the case, which is what we'd like to hear about here now. So I'd like to invite anyone who would like to report back from their group to us to use the raise hand function, if you can, to raise your hand on Zoom. And that is found under the, what menu is that under? Can somebody clue me?
Reactions.
Under reactions. So you'll find that under reactions. If you'll click that on the bottom bar, you'll find the raise hand. No, it's, okay, so we've got, I'm gonna have to call you Barbara's iPad, but if Barbara's iPad could be unmuted, and if we could hear from you, from your group.
Barbara Murphy Sanders on my iPad, it's easier to use. Our group was very good. We all felt that the pandemic was not hard on us, that while we greatly missed being in person at church or wherever we were worshiping, we missed that terribly in our groups, but it wasn't that bad. None of us were alone. None of us had horrible tragedies. We had enough food to eat. We had enough heat, light, and we had all the necessities of life. And we all felt our own personal prayer life was enriched. We learned on Zoom, many good things. And it made us think about the future, bringing up Pope Francis, who mentioned, I forget exactly what of Frank mentioned it, that he spoke that we have to come back to a new normal. And that's, I guess, where we all want to be, that we're going to hopefully make changes, that what we can do to make the world better. And sort of that's it.
Thank you, Barbara. And I want to thank my good friend and Bernadine scholar Tara Siegel for reminding all of us that the raise hand function is found under the participants tab. I saw there was another raised hand underneath Barbara's that has since disappeared. But I'd like to invite anyone else to raise your hand using that. Kevin Lawler, please go ahead and let us hear a little bit of what you all talked about. Can Kevin be unmuted? There we go. Go
Can
ahead,
you hear
Kevin.
this time? Yeah,
We've got
thank you. Yeah, thank you. I'm speaking from Australia, so I welcome the chance to reconnect to CTU. But we were talking about, I think some of the themes I heard was the people have welcomed, that's the wrong word, but certainly observed about the strengthening of domestic church in terms of family. They've appreciated that and valued that. We've also found value in the expansion of relationships or connections with faith communities, whether that be parish or otherwise. That, with being able to use Zoom and so forth, that's been experienced, but it's also highlighted for many people that connection and the ability to actually connect in ways that are new. We had some conversation about language, about use of virtual worship. I think we were a little not offended, resistant of that term, because they said, well, it's still worship. It's like a telephone conversation is a real telephone conversation. It's not a virtual, it's real worship. So we did talk about not using virtual worship as a term, or even talking about face-to-face as in person, because the persons are still there. Persons are still all part of that. And then we did spend a little bit of time reflecting on our different experiences in Australia and the USA a little bit, that we were lucky here that we had good leadership that followed science. And so we were actually starting to talk about the fact of science as truth and the significance of truth in faith. And didn't quite get to expand on that. But, you know, it's just some of those learnings. So thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
We're very grateful you're with us, Kevin, and very grateful to your group as well for those reflections. Salvador, why don't we hear from you if you can unmute?
There we go.
And go ahead, yes.
All right, thank you. So we had a very short conversation. You're absolutely right. When you're having fun, time flies. But we really dive into the, one of our participants talked about virtual choices and looking at the homily. And if you didn't like the homily, you can change channels, right? So we had the point is here that you had choices. You really have to look at that you can have diversity. There was also a concern of contributions, and that, you know, when the pandemic started, there was this thought that churches were going to receive less contributions, and that was not the case. They were hurt, but not as bad as we thought it would be, and that the PPC programs did help. Another one of our participants spoke about the confusion that the pandemic brought and the conspiracy theories that were brought as a result. Some people saying that this was a punishment from God, or that it was the end of the world, or that you know, it was the government plan for artificial intelligence, right? And then, you know, there was also my contribution was that in the beginning in the Latino community was sarcasm. Yeah, this is nothing really. You know, it evolved into, wow, now people are getting sick. And then at the end, when people started dying, then it was something that it was really something to take really serious, especially because, as we probably all know, the Latino community has been hit with the African-American community very hard by COVID because of the lack of resources and the lack of services provided to the community. So it was something that it was at least someone in every family was impacted personally by COVID.
Thank you for that, Salvador. I do think that's one of those things we want to keep our eye on, the different ways that our communities have felt this and are going to continue to experience it for a long time going forward. So we're grateful to you for that. My ever helpful good friend, Tara Siegel. Let's hear from Tara and your group.
Sure. So we had a great conversation that I think one of the most striking points was the idea that any sort of direct translation or attempt at taking what we were doing before into a Zoom setting or whatever the platform wasn't as successful as the interpretations. You know, singing and watching communities that had beautiful music is great, but so is a CD. And watching experiences of communion and Eucharist is great, but when it became actually rich was when that translated into our home environments. When we had different conversations and different experiences of ritual that didn't have to be the exact same. So we talked a lot about that, and then the opportunity that this has presented us to rethink things and to think more compassionately in terms of ritual and what our faith means. How do we listen to those who suddenly it became clear that, oh, not everyone is able to get to a building for communal worship all the time? How do we rethink this, and how do we reimagine continuing opportunities that aren't just kind of, well, we're doing this all here together as a community, and those of you who are at home can watch it. You know, how do we creatively think through this and use this as an opportunity to really transform and be more compassionate in our faith?
Thank you for that, Tara. And thank you to your group too. I want to continue to keep my eye open for a raised hand should one come up, but I also, as we come down toward the end, I want to invite the panel maybe just to weigh in a little bit. One of the themes that I'm hearing coming back from the audience, there are a few of them that have come up, but one that I'm hearing is an alertness to the different opportunities to gather. And I think maybe even circling back to something Steve talked about earlier, a different understanding of belonging, a different understanding of what it means to form community that may grow out of this experience. Does anybody want to follow? Yeah.
So I resonated certainly with what Tara Siegel stated, and it felt to me like issues around access, big issues of accessibility. At multiple levels, and certainly the issues of the physicality of access and all of those are well taken. I have been talking in some sense too about what does it mean to make the religious experience a whole lot more accessible to people across different platforms, and I think that's one of the spaces where we could have a little bit more intentionality to see what transformations can take place.
I think previous participants in Good Faith will recognize our next reporter from a group, Dr. Scott Alexander from CTU's faculty. Scott, good to see you. Go ahead.
Hi, I just wanted to first say how grateful I am to the panel. I mean, I just, as I was cooking part of the time, I just sat and listened to everything.
Multitasker.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that this medium allows, right? And I just feel so blessed by the richness that you've all brought, and also blessed by the richness that comes through the reports of what's gone on in all the small groups. What I just wanted to say is build on what people have said about accessibility, and for us to realize it works the other way as well, right? And that, you know, Barbara began, you know, by a great expression of gratefulness in her group that people have not been, you know, severely impacted. I think this is a self-selected group because we have access to online technology, right? And so many of us, you know, at least have a certain insularity from some of the more deleterious effects of this horrible pandemic. And I'll just leave folks with a story that one of my students he's a Demon student. He's a Togolese priest who ministers in Manitoba with Indigenous peoples. And the restrictions on closing churches have been extraordinarily painful for his community because people don't have any access. And they don't have the financial resources to my parish, Old St. Patrick's, you know, just very quickly understood how to do this so beautifully and so professionally that it was a blessing for those who could connect, right? But to listen to his story in Manitoba, where it's Celsius 40 degrees below zero, and people are willing to come out of their homes if they could just gather in church to worship and can't. And so I think it's really important for us to keep those folks in mind too, because this cuts in so many ways. But maybe that's an invitation to the kind of compassion that I heard Malka talk about, and that I heard Steve talk about, and that I heard Saeed talk about.
Gosh, I want to thank you for that, Scott. We are really just about at the end here, but I think that's the perfect note for us to end on. If I could just editorialize for a moment to agree that for us to come together in good faith as we do, and particularly at a time like this, has to mean that we also have to be willing to commit and to be willing to join together over the boundaries that ordinarily divide our communities, be they religious communities, be they all of the different sorts of communities that we live in. If coming together in this space should affirm anything, it should affirm our desire to be together with one another and to be a help to one another, coming out of this terrible year that we have all lived through, to try to live together as friends, friends of God and one another, and to build a better world as we all go forward. So I'm very grateful for that, and I think it's a suitable conclusion for us here. And that's going to bring this portion of our program tonight to an end. It's been a great pleasure to be able to bring this panel to you here, and we look forward to bringing more In Good Faiths to you in the future.